Hi everyone, I am Kirsten Alberts and I am a trauma counselor specializing in familial abuse. Let's just get this out of the way. As always, no contact is not a resort and it doesn't happen overnight and for no reason. No contact is a result. And one of the main causes of this result is when the abuse doesn't just involve the adult child anymore, it involves their children. Most adult children of toxic parents will endure their abuse for decades, if not forever. They have been conditioned to normalize so much abuse that they have no idea what normal parenting even looks like. These children have been taught that they have no worth, no value outside of what they can do for their parents. So they keep taking the abuse because they've never learned to attach enough value for it to occur to them to put a stop to it. It's when they have children of their own that they start to see that something is horribly, horribly wrong. It may not be easy for these adult children to attach value to themselves, but do you know what they find real easy? Attaching value to their children. And that is when several cans of worms begin to open. These adult children have been told their whole lives that they were difficult or a nuisance or a burden. A firm favorite is, you just wait till you have children, then you'll see what a sacrifice it is. When these adult children have children of their own, they realize pretty quickly that they are experiencing none of what their parents told them they would. I mean, none of us are exactly thrilled with dirty diapers or sleep deprivation, sure. But we know and accept that, let's say, the shittier bits all form part of the wonders and delights of parenting. Sacrifice, nuisance, and burden are the last ways we describe parenting. So when our parents insist we do things their way, things start to get messy. If you're new here, I do a lot of my research in forums and support groups for adult children of toxic parents and for parents of estranged children. What you're about to hear are quotes and counsel from both sides. The subject of grandchildren in both groups is a massive one and easily dominates the discussions in the groups for estranged parents. In the groups for adult children, the parents who have become grandparents fall into two camps. Grandparents who want nothing to do with their grandchildren and grandparents who want everything to do with their grandchildren. This video is not for the adult children of the first camp. I can't imagine the pain of having a parent who wants nothing to do with your children. But having experienced the second camp firsthand, all I can say to you is that you have dodged a massive bullet. You've dodged a whole artillery of what these grandparents from the second camp can fire at their families. This video is for the adult children who believe things would be different with their children, who believe that their parents had changed or mellowed and would never put their grandchildren through the same shit they put them through, so allowed their parents full access to their children, only to discover to their horror that their parents were repeating the cycle, but this time it was their children who were being conditioned to normalize it. At first, the adult children try to fix things. They've heard since their children's births how much their parents adore their grandchildren, and the last thing they want is to upset their parents' relationships with the grandchildren they seem to dote on. But what started out as a bit of spoiling has gotten completely out of hand, and what began as grandmotherly or grandfatherly indulgence has gotten dangerous. And most, if not all, of these problems come straight from the grandparents' abject refusal to respect the way their adult children wish to parent. When these adult children have children of their own, they may not always know how badly they were raised or why, but they do know that they want to raise their children differently. What none of them know is just how badly their parents are going to take it. Like any parents, these adult children assume that they have autonomy over how they want their children to be treated. And although their parents may not always understand or agree with a different parenting style, they try to respect it. What they never see coming is how far these grandparents will go to prove that they won't. They like the hierarchy as it is. Parents on top with their children way down at the bottom following their parents' instructions. In normal families, this gap in the hierarchy shortens as the children become responsible adults. In a toxic family, it never does. It doesn't matter if these children have grown up to be successful people and excellent parents, they can be CEOs and president of the PTA. Their parents will still find ways to keep them in their place at the bottom of the hierarchy. So when there is a disagreement, when the children have to ask the parents to stop a certain behavior, all hell breaks loose. And no amount of reasonable, rational explanations, no matter how gently and compassionately they are communicated, they are not going to make a shred of difference in getting a toxic grandparent to listen to reason. It's going to make things worse because your goals are different. You want a healthy relationship where the family works together to keep its children safe. The parents want their hierarchy, with you blindly obeying orders, not dishing them out. This bizarre line of thinking is incredibly difficult to wrap our heads around, especially when a child's well-being is at stake. So I went back to the support groups for parents of estranged children to show you how this works. As usual, there's a pattern here, and as always, it starts with the pain these grandparents are forced to suffer at the hands of their heartless children when they go no contact and take their children with them. Here are some quotes I've collected. How could anyone be this cruel, especially to the ones who gave them life? My heart is so broken, I can feel every splinter. My suffering is endless. How did they become this heartless? And as always, when they've done laying the sympathy groundwork and are certain that they have the other members' full support, they get a lot more comfortable telling each other what they really think. It is here where we can start to see that what these parents have done and what their adult children have done to try to fix things so that their parents can continue to have relationships with their grandchildren. Only their parents don't see it that way at all. Here is a good example. This grandmother says, my daughter is jealous of my closeness with my grandson, so she constantly has to control everything he eats. I can't give him an ice cream cone or a piece of candy or anything that she considers something he would appreciate. Food is one of the top reasons cited on the support groups for adult children as to why they can no longer give their parents access to their children. I can safely say that none of these adult children denied their parents contact with their grandchildren over a few sweets. There is horror story after horror story detailing the lengths these grandparents go to give their children foods that they are allergic to or that they will make their medical conditions worse. Some of these grandchildren have ended up in the emergency room, and all for the simple reason that their grandparents won't be bossed around. They just will not move on from this fixation that children do not give orders to their parents, and these are the bizarre lengths they go to prove it. The way that this grandmother portrays the story of not being allowed to give sweets to her grandson makes it look like her daughter is the one being totally unreasonable. All these stories do, it's the whole point. So please allow me to translate. I'd hazard a guess that in this case, and countless others like it, this woman's daughter had repeatedly asked, told, and begged her mother to stop giving her son foods he shouldn't have. But instead of agreeing to a simple ask that would keep her grandson safe and her relationship with him secure, she went behind his mother's back like a 2-year-old to get her way. This is where we can start to see why toxic grandparents don't and won't listen to reason. It is this unbelievably juvenile line of thinking that is at the source. Unfortunately, it's also why their adult children have such a hard time trying to understand why their parents react so badly to something that is to the benefit of all involved, especially their children. It is nearly impossible to wrap our heads around a grown adult who would jeopardize the safety of any child, let alone a grandchild they purport to adore, just to show their kids that they can't boss them around. What's far more important to wrap our heads around, though, is that these grandparents' behavior may be juvenile. It's the consequences that are not. If a child behaves like a child, the consequences are minor and expected. It's a child. But when an adult with power and resources and authority behaves like a child determined to get their way, the consequences can be devastating, leaving these adult children with no choice but to remove access to their children entirely before things get even more catastrophic than they already are. What's even more difficult to understand is why these grandparents are not just hell-bent on ignoring the rules, but why they go out of their way to do the complete opposite of what their children ask. Children don't understand rules or why it's not okay for them to have certain things, which is why they need a responsible adult around to guide them. A fact that these grandparents exploit for all it's worth, creating an us, the grandparents and grandchildren, versus them, the parents situation. Like a child on a playground who wants the other children to like them better. Giving grandchildren things their parents can't afford or haven't financially prioritized yet or simply don't want them to have is a perfect way to groom a child into believing that their grandparents are loving and amazing while their parents are unfair and uncaring. They tell their grandchildren that their parents are stupid, pathetic, and don't care about them, and that the only place they feel safe and loved is with their grandparents. Again, this unbelievably juvenile they love me more behavior has catastrophic consequences, with scared and confused children who withdraw, lie, keep secrets, and even lash out at their parents, while their grandparents encourage and reward them for it. What makes this even more diabolical is how no one believes this is even a problem, let alone abuse, because who bitches about a grandparent spoiling a grandchild? All grandparents spoil their grandchildren, and all grandchildren love them for it. And if they're offering to babysit and giving them things that their parents can't afford, they should be grateful, not whining about it. There are thousands of examples just like this. Grandparents who buy absurd amounts of junk food or tech that is inappropriate or that their grandchildren aren't ready for. Grandparents who drive drunk with their grandchildren in the car, who leave them unattended in parking lots, who leave pornography and pills out for them to find, who say they're taking them one place and go somewhere else miles away while they ignore their children's panicked calls and messages. They play favourites with their other grandchildren. They criticise and insult them. They call them fat, stupid, useless, whenever one of them won't fall in line. Which brings me to the next problem with juvenile behaviour. It's impulsive. And lots of the behaviour in these examples isn't planned. These grandparents simply won't stop to think that driving drunk or leaving their pills around has consequences. And when their adult children have something to say about it, they resort to the hierarchy again, where their brats have no place telling their parents what they can and cannot do. So now you have the adult children who are determined to get their parents to see reason, and you have parents who are just as determined to say what they like, to turn their grandchildren against their parents, and to do as they please. And if their children have a problem with it, tough, they don't get to boss them around. The same way I could safely say earlier that no contact wasn't about a few sweets, I can also safely say that none of these grandparents were asked to stop hurting or endangering their grandchildren once or twice. These adult children try everything. Talks, meetings, letters, mediation, therapy, begging these grandparents to see reason, so they have no room to say they weren't warned. Now that we can see why none of this works, this is where I want you to see why it makes things worse. They don't just ignore, refuse, and do the opposite of what their adult children ask. They retaliate. Okay, brace yourselves. This grandmother says, "My daughter just hates her brother, and now we can't even talk to the grandchildren on the phone, and we pay the phone bill. How can something like this change our whole family dynamic?" Okay, it turns out this grandmother is referring to, is a convicted sex offender. Her daughter had made it clear that he wasn't to be around her children, so her mother had invited him to see them behind her daughter's back. After the members had all agreed what a heartless, unreasonable bitch her daughter was, who had no right to disrespect her mother by telling her who she may and may not invite to her home, their advice was to stop paying the phone bill. Not fix things with her daughter, not promise that her brother won't be around her children, to cut access to the phone she speaks to her grandchildren on, because that'll show them. This grandmother says, "My disgusting daughter-in-law has refused to send me any more pictures of my grandchildren. This is not about their protection or internet security like she claims. It's all about her control over me. The punishment certainly doesn't match the crime. To deny me this is very excessive for sharing my happiness on social media." I think you can already guess what really happened here. After repeatedly asking her mother-in-law not to post pictures of her children on public profiles and being flatly ignored, she stopped sending her pictures. This grandmother then got tech savvy and plastered her minor grandchildren on every public platform she could find. The thread ended with the grandmother and the other members chuckling to themselves and saying good luck to the daughter-in-law on finding the rest of the pictures. It is at this point that the adult children implement no contact. It's not just the result of what their parents have done, it is the result of how their parents have reacted and then retaliated to the simplest and most reasonable of requests. There are few things more terrifying to a parent, well, a good one anyway, than discovering that the people they thought they could trust have put their children in danger. More terrifying is discovering that they can and have used their grandchildren to get back at them by deliberately and intentionally putting their children in even more danger every time they beg them to stop. I'm about to read some of the responses these grandparents gave after their children had to set these boundaries. But before I do, if there's one thing I'd like you to gain from this video, it's this. These are boundaries that should never have had to be set at all, because whatever these grandparents did to push their children into setting them should never ever have happened in the first place. I talk about deadlocks a lot, and this one is just as impossible. You have the adult children who go no contact because their parents violated a boundary, and you have their parents saying the boundary would never have been violated had it not been set. Both are wrong, because none of this is even about boundaries. This is about parents who don't care about how their behavior affects their children, only how their children's reaction to it affects them. To make this whole debacle a little clearer, take the family card out of it. Family cards are for family who take care of one another. People who hurt children don't get to play the family card. So think about it this way. If a stranger had said or done any one of these things, even once to a child, we'd all be baying for blood, not finding ways to set boundaries so that they get to spend more time with our children. It also gives you a pretty good idea of how far these adult children have gone to try to keep these grandparents in their children's lives. And this is what they get as a response. "We refuse to jump through hoops and give into this manipulation for us to see my grandchildren. The only one guilty of not respecting this boundary BS is her. Kids do not give orders to their betters. I am sick of dealing with grown children who don't know how to navigate being adults around their parents. I will never be told what I can and cannot do. What's next? An entire rule book? Ridiculous. They are my grandchildren and she needs to realize that. There will always be a next time and something else. Soon you will have to do anything they say or want. Shut it down now. They have lost their minds. Why would you abide by an unstable person's rules? It's almost comical. They are clueless as to how ridiculous they sound. I refuse to be held hostage by kids. What about our feelings? What about our perspective? These brats have no interest in a parent's perspective. These parents keep on asking for everyone to see things from their perspective, and I keep getting hell for it, for obliging. So here are some more of their perspectives. This insanity doesn't need to be rewarded. It needs to be stopped. A daughter that makes herself judge and jury of her mother, at some point life will put them back in their places. Anyone excuses this behavior by saying our kids have the right to do whatever they choose is actually promoting estrangement. These kids have no idea how to communicate. They simply enjoy being in control. Even if they finally communicate with you, it will be a one-sided communication with no compromise. Blaming their children for being unable to communicate and compromise is downright laughable. It's actually embarrassing, considering the lengths that these adult children have gone to try to talk to their parents, only to be told they're disrespectful, lying brats who just want to cause trouble. And the bigger issue here is that these grandparents' behavior has left no room for compromise. I mean, what compromises exactly would they like these adult children to agree to? That they can leave their pills out some of the time, drive drunk every second trip, tell their grandchildren that their parents don't love them every other weekend. It's absurd. And what's even more absurd is that if these adult children did agree to something this ridiculous, their parents wouldn't. The next stage is just as sickening, just in different ways. You have the adult children who are reeling from the panic of their children's endangerment and trying to cope with the pain and shock of having to go no contact to protect them, who are now told they are heartless monsters for doing this to their parents, because no toxic pattern would be complete without a total role reversal, where the parents are now the victims and it's their children who are the monsters and stand accused of the very things their parents did to cause no contact in the first place. Here we go. Estranged children deceive the innocent children to hurt us in the worst way possible. They are still putting themselves first over their own children. They have to cut off access to the grandchildren. That is how they get attention and support for their revolting actions. She is evil, using my grandchild as a weapon and poisoning her mind. It's all in their minds, and our grandbabies are suffering. I feel so much for the grandparents who have lost their grandchildren due to their children's decision to inflict that pain and suffering onto their own children. I can't even imagine how my grandchildren's little hearts feel. It's traumatizing me, and they are suffering because of it. The worst is the parent poisoning them, making it a terrifying experience for the kids. My grandchildren are suffering badly. Let's just put this whole poisoning their minds crap to bed while we're here. All poisoning minds means to toxic parents is telling the truth, which is the last thing any toxic parent wants. So they accuse their children of poisoning their children's minds as a sort of insurance policy for when the truth does come out. It's okay for these grandparents to tell their grandchildren that their parents are pathetic and don't love them. But the moment the truth threatens to come out because they're no longer around to deflect it, lie about it, rewrite history, or play the victim, it is the moment their children learn to poison everyone's minds. Anyway, notice how all these grandchildren are suffering. The last quote was from a woman who had never even met her grandchildren. By her own admission, her children had moved thousands of miles away just to get away from her years ago, and she hadn't heard anything from them since. She had no idea how her grandchildren were faring, but it was completely comfortable telling with everyone who would listen how badly they were suffering. Because what's better than one false victim in a pity party? More false victims, especially children. Pushing the notion of suffering children gets these grandparents all the support and sympathy they need. What it also gives them is the reason they need to justify not wanting to see their evil children ever again, and to pursue the relationships with their grandchildren without them. Embrace yourselves. Your daughter is abusive as she has no relationship with you. Why should we have relationships with abusive people? She hates me, so she's going to punish her own kids. She is evil. I have no interest in seeing any of the adults in that family. A relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild is separate from the parent and the grandparent. Parents shouldn't push their issues onto their children and break the grandparent-grandchild bond. If my kids don't want to see me, fine, but they have nothing to gain by keeping the children from us other than just to hurt us. They are sick. I won't ever forgive my daughter for withholding the grandchildren from me and telling them lies about me. Even if she has a change of heart, I don't want her back. The damage is done. We are never required to forgive this. I don't want to reconcile with my son. He is proving how disgusting he is, but it shouldn't affect me seeing my grandchildren. I would be more than happy to have no further contact with my son. I only want to see my granddaughter. She was my best friend. The problem, other than the obvious one of wanting to rid themselves of their own children and replace them with ones who can be more easily controlled, is that there's just no coming back from what these grandparents have done. They haven't just hurt and triangulated their grandchildren, endangered their lives, or tried to convince them to run away from home. They've proven over and over again that they will retaliate with more danger and more deceit whenever their brats get into their heads that they can boss their parents around by asking them to stop. They can cry their self-inflicted suffering all they like. There is nothing that will convince a parent to put their children back in harm's way, unsupervised, and at the complete mercy of their parents' spite. So they take the knocks of their parents' smear campaigns, often losing entire families because of them, and protect their children more fiercely than ever. But these grandparents still don't give up. They are determined to get their way one way or another, so they decide they can bide their time until their grandchildren turn 18. In the meantime, they keep themselves happy by convincing themselves and each other that their grandchildren will behave in the same rotten way to their parents and go no contact just as soon as they are able, and their revenge would be all the sweeter for it. It's interesting here how they all say that no contact is the worst possible thing any kid can do to any parent, and that no parent ever deserves this kind of treatment, whether they are abusive or not. But they all can't wait for the day their grandchildren go no contact so that they can say their children deserved it. Here we go. These kids will get paid back when the grandchildren turn 18. I will continue to send toys so that when they're older, they will find me. I still send money to my grandchildren. They can't take that away from me. Sending money makes sure everyone knows my side of the street is clean. Stand your ground. When my grandchildren get older, they will look for me. Modeling this behavior, what do they think is going to happen to them when their children just decide they did something wrong? It will be sweet poetic justice, and I'll be over here in my big house waiting for them to come and live with me. I can't wait until they leave my daughter when they get older. After all, she is teaching them that as her mother and their grandmother, I have no value. They will grow up to feel that she has no value. Oh well. I still send money, not to reconcile, F that, to show these brats that they can't control everything. Petty? I sure hope so. Well, there you have it. The money and toys are not to show love or that they want to reconcile. It is to make up for being unable to bribe their grandchildren in person, to show their brats that they are still in control, and to show everyone else that their side of the street is clean. As for biding their time until the grandchildren turn 18, well, this gives their parents more than enough time to give their children all the tools and information they'll need to make damn sure that their children will never be the victims they were. So obviously, this diabolical little plan backfires, and the grandchildren have no intention of being around anyone this toxic, let alone the last people on earth who should have hurt them or their parents. But a strange thing happens along the way. The moment these grandchildren start turning around 10 years old, their grandparents start to change their minds. In the previous videos, we saw how these parents missed the sweet young things their own children used to be. They just hate the people that they turned into. It wasn't a stretch to conclude that they all loved it when their children were young enough to be abused and had no choice but to take it. And the exact same thing appears to happen with the grandchildren. By the time their grandchildren are teenagers, all their suffering at the hands of their terrible parents magically evaporates, and by the time they are adults, their grandparents want nothing to do with them. I imagine this also has something to do with the fact that as the grandchildren get older, they have more ways of getting in touch with their grandparents. So the longer they keep them waiting, the more they have to accept that their dreams of revenge aren't going to come true, and they can all go join the ranks of their horrible children. Okay, we've seen what happens when the grandchildren keep away from their grandparents. This is what happens when they don't, and why it's so important to tell them the truth. Telling children the truth about their grandparents can feel like you are ripping yourself apart from the inside out. We want to protect our children from the merest mention of abuse, not lay it all bare for them. But we have got to remember that they already know something is wrong. They've seen and heard it firsthand. Their parents are not the cause of all this mess, but they are responsible for getting their children through it and out the other side as healthily as possible. We've also got to remember not to underestimate them, and that knowledge is power. And if there's one thing children detest, it's being kept in the dark. It makes them feel unsafe, and it erodes their trust. And the last thing any good parent wants is a child who knows there's something wrong but doesn't trust a parent enough to teach them how to deal with it effectively. This goes for children who have abusive, neglectful, or absent mothers or fathers as well. We are all tempted to say things like, they do love you, just in their own way, or your mother/father/grandparent does care, they're just having a tough time. Because all platitudes like this teaches children is that abuse, neglect, and abandonment are a normal part of love, and to expect it and to tolerate it in their relationships. This 12-year-old granddaughter organized to see her grandmother only to be turned away the moment she asked that they not speak about her mother. She says, "My daughter just wanted a pity party, and I guess her daughter gave her one. She was crying when she left, but I don't care. I don't miss these messed up grandchildren. I have a life." This grandmother says, "My grandson came over, but I turfed his ass out when he got disrespectful, talking about his mother like she isn't a piece of shit. These grandchildren have turned out exactly like our spoiled, entitled kids. I will never be disrespected in my own home. They can have them." These are unfortunately the best case scenarios. The worst cases are the ones where the grandchildren did end up living with their grandparents, were abused the same way their parent was, and were battling drug and alcohol addictions, self-harm, abusive relationships, and a whole host of self-destructive behaviors while their parents were powerless to stop them. So, if you are still fighting the guilt of keeping your children away from your toxic parents and still battling with the accusations of being a monster, you can stop. You are not a monster. Only monsters hurt children and then insult, shun, and retaliate against the people who protect them. You are a goddamn hero. Right, thank you to my patrons who asked for this video. If you'd like to chat to me and see more of my work, please join us. The link is in the description. See you soon.